Welcome everyone to the first BS Cubed webinar of 2024. I'm really delighted to be chairing the session today. My name's Danny. I'm the Early Career Committee Chair for BS Cubed. And before I welcome our presenters, I'd just like to give you an introduction to BS Cubed, who's hosting this webinar today. So we're an established international membership organisation and charity committed to the study of soil science. We bring together those working within academia and have a growing interest, growing membership amongst practitioners implementing soil science within the industry and those with a keen interest in soils. We plan to host 10 webinars during 2024, so do keep an eye out on our website for further details. Before we begin, just a couple more housekeeping notes. As there are so many of you here today, all your microphones have been muted. We'll be taking questions at the end of both presentations together, and we'll be monitoring these throughout the webinar. So if you have any questions, please do submit them by 12:50 to allow us to get through as many as we can in the question time. And there is a raise your hand button, but as I said, we're going to keep the questions into the chat box. Today's presentation also has been awarded BASIS and CBD points, so if you've registered with either body, please contact us directly after the event. And finally, please be aware that we are recording today's presentation. So today's event has been organised in collaboration with the Geological Society of London, and I'd like to welcome Megan O'Donnell, Head of Policy and Communications, to give a brief introduction to the organisation. So over to you, Megan.
So as Danny mentioned, my name is Dr. Megan O'Donnell and I'm the Head of Policy and Communications at the Geological Society. And I'll tell you a little bit about the Geological Society before we get going. The Geological Society is the UK's learned and professional body for geoscience, representing over 12,000 members both in the UK and worldwide. As the national forum for debate and discussion of earth science topics, we have a responsibility to communicate the importance of geoscience and geoscientific information and skills to society, to the government, to the media and to the general public, as well as fostering debate and discussion between scientific communities. So I'm particularly excited that this webinar is happening in collaboration between ourselves and the British Society of Soil Science today. I work in our policy team, which is sort of the relevance of the context of the webinar and its COP and the implications for sort of soil science going forward theme. And our policy team does a number of things to engage government, parliament and policymakers on different topics. So it makes sure that relevant scientific information is communicated with those that need it to make sound evidence-based policies, and also to make sure that the people who are making policies are connected to experts and expertise who hold the custodianship of that information. And so we run events and we run events like this webinar in order to touch base with the latest scientific subjects and developments in this area, in order to better understand how the topics that we're representing on behalf of the community are related to public policy concerns. So I'm really excited to hear from both our speakers today about this important topic, but also from you as an audience in the question and chat box in terms of what's important to you guys that ourselves and the BSSS continue to focus on in this area. Thanks very much, Danny. I'm sorry about the technical hiccup at the beginning.
No problem at all. Thank you so much for being with us, Megan. I'd now like to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Bruce Lascelles. Many of you will know Bruce. He was our BS Cubed President 2021 to 2022, and he's a trustee of BS Cubed. He is a chair of the Grants and Awards Committee and was chair of the World Congress of Soil Science Working Group, as well as the director of the company World Congress of Soil Science 2022, set up to deliver the event. Bruce is past chair of the Institute of Professional Soil Scientists, which merged with BS Cubed. So Bruce has a background in soil science and forestry and undertook a PhD investigating the development of soils in North Wales over the Holocene in relation to environmental change and human impacts. After completing a postdoc research project at the University of Leicester looking at the mechanisms of soil erosion and rill formation, he moved into consultancy and has developed significant expertise in soil and agricultural land classification survey, the design and supervision of appropriate soil handling methodologies, and in the habitat creation, restoration and translocation, where he's worked across a wide range of habitats, including lowland raised bogs, blanket bog, heathland, marshy and short grassland and river systems. Bruce is currently the UK Director of Sustainable Land Management at Arcadis and is passionate about promoting the importance and wider understanding of soils. He's also chair of the CIRIA Soil Community of Practice, a member of the CIWEM Natural Capital Network Steering Group, and sits on the Cranfield University Environment Industry and Advisory Panel. So over to you, Bruce. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Danny, and good afternoon to everyone. Can I just check you can see the presentation?
Yes, all good.
Fantastic. Yeah, so I'm going to focus on perhaps sort of close to the surface, and I'll talk about COP, but also kind of just trying to pull the focus into in terms of what's next in relation to one particular aspect around nature-based solutions in that context of the climate and the biodiversity crisis. But first of all, I want to go back to the end of last year with that question: where does soils feature at COP28? And I think it's really worth looking at this as it leads on to the question of where we need to continue to focus and where we need to continue to drive for that sort of greater recognition of the role soils play. So it was a really, really active time for BS3 and for soils more widely at COP28. And I think it was a really very definite step change that I've seen, and that's the third COP I've been to. And I've just put a few of the highlights onto the screen here with some photos from myself and some from Jack, our current president, as well, who was there. So we ran a joint event with CASH, so that's the Coalition of Action for Soil Health, and also the Climate Centre. It was focused on natural carbon sequestration and leveraging soils for mitigation, storage and biodiversity. We also took part in a side event on strengthening NDCs, so that's nationally determined contributions for soil health and learning around that from practical experience. And again, I think that was a really important step. I think it's the first time that soils have been included, and soil health has been included in NDCs as well. We took part in a panel discussion with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in relation to nature-based solutions in urban development, and many other conversations were had. And so I think it's, as I said, it was a really significant step change in both our own engagement, so the BS3 engagement, but also in how often and in what context soils were being discussed. And so with that step change, I guess the question is, as I said, what next for soil, this sort of critical resource, which is non-renewable, multifunctional, incredibly diverse, and so on. And so I think we need to ask those questions: how do we build further on the messaging and the engagement around how important soils are to so much of what we rely on? And that really is building on, as I said, that sort of breadth of conversations which I heard. Oh, sorry, my screen has flipped. And so how do we, as I said, how do we ensure others recognise the role soils play in plant health, in animal health, in our own health and well-being, all of which is so critical in that conversation around climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And so that's why I wanted just to focus on nature-based solutions, why those are important, and therefore why we also must be talking about the role that soils play in these as well. And clearly carbon is going to be a key consideration and a key driver. But I do think it's really important when we talk about the role of soils in the climate and biodiversity crisis, that we do so in the context of the societal benefits which come through the implementation of some of the changes which are required. Okay, so nature-based solutions, what are these? So there is now a legal requirement in the UK for developers to deliver 10% biodiversity net gain. Now, many organisations already have their own targets for biodiversity net gain, some of which are definitely more aspirational than the 10% that's been set by government. But what we have here is a key driver for change, and that's changing how land is used and managed. And I think it really brings into the conversation the concept of stewardship. And so it's really incredibly important that the role of soils in supporting the sustainable land use change required to deliver these targets is fully understood. And I've just pulled out a definition of nature-based solutions on the screen there. And whilst this doesn't mention soils specifically, they are, and definitely as a soil scientist, they are at the heart of this, working with nature. And we've got this reference to the management of natural and semi-natural ecosystems. And so we need to understand how they function, how those parts link together. And I think it's really important as well in this conversation that the role of soils is recognised in all aspects of land use change that will be needed to deliver outcomes from nature-based solutions. And so I've got over the next few slides some of the sorts of nature-based solutions that you might not perhaps think about. I want to talk about scale as well, and this particularly focus on the urban context. And I think these are also perhaps elements where perhaps the importance of the soil component is not always adequately recognised or understood. So first of all, sustainable drainage systems. This is one area, and SUDs, as many people refer to them, are so much more than just sort of grassy swale. So there is a grassy swale on the screen there, but SUDs can be multifunctional. They can support biodiversity. They're part of our streetscapes, making up open space, which can bring so many health and well-being benefits to the communities in which they're sited. And the nature of the soils which support SUDs will be critical in that multifunctionality. And also then it's important to sort of recognise that they don't need to necessarily comprise soils, but they could be constructed from soil forming materials to provide the very specific functions that are needed. And again, that's another aspect that can support reuse of materials and the circular economy and so on. Green walls is perhaps another feature. These bring landscape, air quality benefits and other benefits as well. And again, the nature of the materials used or designed in the sort of constructed soils context to support these will be critical in ensuring their success. And then kind of following on from that theme, finally, sort of green and brown roofs, where again, the nature of the materials used will be critical in their success. And again, you start to see that ability or the opportunity to not necessarily use soils that have been taken from somewhere else, but to create soils from materials that you find within these contexts and these environments as well. And I mentioned scale earlier as well, and I think it's really important that there's recognition that the benefits we can drive from having the right soils supporting nature-based solutions can happen at all scales. It's not something that can only be driven through sort of large-scale rural land use change. And there's a really sort of good growing body of evidence that small-scale changes within the urban landscape, perhaps to use the phrase "greening the grey," bring really tangible benefits in terms of community engagement, increases in journeys by foot or bicycle, but also in particular bringing greater understanding of and care for the natural environment. And I think in the urban context and probably the rural context in many cases as well, this is so important in relation to engagement, in relation to improving the quality of life. And it can really start to drive the conversations about the natural environment, which will open up new opportunities to talk to different audiences about soils and the role soils play as well. And I think in these sort of conversations, inevitably, when looking at these sort of solutions and when you start talking about benefits, the conversations will turn to qualifying, quantifying, and monetizing the benefits. And whilst there are different opinions on whether we should or can assign a monetary value to the natural world and the benefits received, I think it's really helpful to work through these steps as these elevate the importance of what we're trying to achieve. And as I mentioned, they'll provide many more opportunities for conversations to be had around the soil component. And I think from my experience, in the urban context, it can be quite easy to identify, a reasonably wide range of potential stakeholders who may benefit from a change in that environment. You can start to look at, quite a wide range of means and ways to measure those benefits. I mentioned about, greater commuting miles by foot or bicycle, etc., because people are enjoying these environments. And you can then start to think about monetizing those benefits in different ways. But as I said, that there's a growing body of evidence that truly integrating nature into our designs does bring value, and it does start to then drive the solutions that we need around climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, as well as sort of improvements and enhancements in terms of biodiversity. And just on the sort of the monetizing point, I've just pulled out this example in relation to London trees, which we published a few years ago, I think now. But it's this calculation of over £130 million worth of benefits in relation to property value, air quality, carbon sequestration, health and well-being, etc. And the point I wanted to make here is I think perhaps as soil scientists, we need to tap into this narrative to drive better recognition of soils, to drive more care, more thought, more monitoring, more data, more research, and so on. All the things that, very often we're kind of crying out to get or to find funding for as well. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to promote this concept of sort of system thinking amongst others, and the sort of critical importance of understanding the physical environment, and from our perspective as a soil scientist, from understanding the place and the role of soils within that. So, how do those soil forming factors of geology, topography, climate, time, land use, and land management come together to create the soils that we see in any given location? And if we have that understanding, we can use that to start to design the soils that are needed to support the landscapes and environments that we need, notwithstanding that we want to be working with working with nature, as that description said, and maximizing the reuse of materials that we've got available in any given location as well. And I put after climate, I put change there in brackets. I think we also need to make sure that we're designing and thinking about the soils that are needed for what the climate will be in coming years and coming decades as well. And then very often, again, I think we miss that long-term view. There's a very lot of sort of short-termism perhaps around decisions that are made. So I just want to end with two examples of where sort of a focus on this sort of new approach has brought value with soils and the physical environment very much at the front of the thinking and the approaches that's been taken. So the first is Langgarth Garden Village, which is a new proposed development in Cornwall. And on this project, there's been a real drive to embed an understanding of the soils and the physical environment in decision making right from the outset. And in the context of this project, that's particularly important, as this development will have a relatively long build-out program, so potentially not completed for maybe 20 or 30 years. So we undertook extensive soil and agricultural land classification surveys to inform the planning process, and that was very much a start of the conversations. But this information is now being used to build on and to assess the capability, essentially the capability of the available resources within the boundary and the footprint of this development to support things like ongoing agricultural production in parts of the site which are not yet to be developed and may not be developed for another 5-10 years. Looking at how we can make best use of the soil materials available to support local food growing, to support the landscape and the landscaping that's required, but also then to support ecological mitigation. And this has been set out as a sort of an overarching soil strategy, and I think it's been really important, not a complex document, but it's providing a platform for more detailed design and planning. And it's also just there in the planning documents as a reminder that people need to come back to that and make sure that the right questions are being asked, the right information is available, and the right expertise is being used on the project. And yeah, so and ultimately it's hoped that this will help and ensure that the best use of soils is made to support the delivery of the vision for this development. So Landgarth aspires to be a place where people will live, work and thrive. That's one of their taglines. But that can only happen if the whole system, including the people who are living here, and it's a system created on the soils, is healthy and functioning. So I might not see the end of the project, but it's going to be really interesting to see how this develops and how we can take that concept and the strategy into the level of detail that's required to actually design, create and build what will be at Landgarth as well. Excuse me. And the next example, another housing development, and in this case it's Otterpool Park in Kent, and this is a proposed garden town. The master plan, the overall master plan, is for up to 10,000 homes, new homes, so a large site. The site is currently predominantly agricultural land and extensive areas of agricultural land. You can see on the screen there as well. But really key to the development of the master plan for this site has been the understanding of the existing natural environment, so that the design can work with nature, to use that phrase again, but really importantly to deliver multifunctional green spaces. So really having that concept of nature-based solutions, of biodiversity net gain, of integration of the natural world with the built environment, very much at its heart. And I've just shown a few some of the design graphics from the project here. But I just wanted to highlight some of the the key metrics, perhaps, which are worth thinking about. So firstly, this phrase, it's a landscape-led design, which really enabled the team to draw on that understanding of the system, of the natural environment, of the existing biodiversity, but also the soil resources that are available on the site as well. I've just added this. It didn't actually. This is more recent. It didn't come out on the slide on the metrics, but it's a scheme which will deliver nutrient neutrality through the design of the green spaces and the master plan. And again, that's a reasonably new but a really important concept to enable developments to happen, but with also minimising the potential impact and the long-term impact on the natural world as well. So this project will deliver 20% biodiversity net gain, which is obviously well above the legal mandated requirement, and that's been, again, comes to the heart of what this project's been about, because this project's been running for many years before that biodiversity net gain target was kind of being talked about properly. But I do want to just focus on this point here, where it's a scheme which is going to deliver 50% open space, and this is perhaps where some of my conversations have been focused on, and I think it's an area where we do need to question, we do need to delve a bit deeper, because a development with 50% open space is great, it's a great concept, but we need to ensure, absolutely, as I've been talking through the presentation, that it's quality open space and it's multifunctional open space, not just in the uses that it has, but in the services and the benefits that we get from that space. And I think that's what really then starts to make a design, truly kind of forward thinking, and really then brings in that absolute requirement to understand the soils and that physical environment. So perhaps then if I sort of go back to, okay, well, that initial question, what next for soils? We clearly need to keep the momentum going. It was a step change at COP28. We just need to keep picking up that pace and picking up on those threads. And I just tried to kind of perhaps sum that up in terms of what I see and where my focus would be. So We need to draw on site-specific knowledge. We need to have that understanding of the system, noting that may or probably will require field-based surveys, but also drawing on newer emerging technologies, remote sensing, the use of drones, and so on. We need to make sure the right expertise is brought to the problem, but in that concept, being really conscious of working in a truly collaborative, multidisciplinary manner. And as I mentioned, we need to make sure we're delivering quality outcomes. And so, as I've mentioned in terms of what I call that concept of soil health, soil function will be absolutely critical to the success, the true success of these schemes. And as I mentioned, we also need to tap into those conversations around quantification and monetization as well, to make sure that is driving future understanding, future work, future research, etc., around soils. And really, that's hopefully what will help drive us towards and enable us to realise what R.N. Jones at the World Congress of Soil Science about 18 months ago called this new normal, this concept of sustainable soils that are part of and essential for and perceived to be and understood to be essential for climate neutrality, reversing biodiversity loss, safeguarding human health, and so on. And so, hopefully we're not too far away from really starting to see that, particularly with that momentum that perhaps came from COP28. Yeah, and I will leave it there.
Thanks, Bruce. It's really great to hear that the conversation is becoming more prominent at COP around soils, and then seeing some examples of plans for nature-based solutions closer to home. So I'll remind you all to submit your questions in the question box, and we'll come back to them at the end of our session. So thank you, Bruce, and we'll move on to our next speaker, Professor David Manning. David is a geologist by training and was president of the Geological Society of London from 2014 to 2016. He's also a member of BS Cubed, working as a professor of soil science at Newcastle University and an honorary professor of soil mineral processes at Edinburgh University. His academic interests focus on the interface between biology and geology. David played a major role in the delivery of the 22nd World Congress of Soil Science as co-chair of the Scientific Programme Committee and was director of the company World Congress of Soil Science 2022, set up to deliver that event. David is committed to using his experience to help achieve the goals of net zero. His work focuses on the processes that take influence on the reaction of silicate minerals derived from rocks within soils, as these provide crop nutrients and at the same time remove CO2. He also carried out extensive research on carbon in soils using thermal analysis to develop methods to distinguish organic and inorganic carbon and to understand the transformation of organic carbon that participates in the biological carbon cycle to form inorganic carbon, which does not play a role in that cycle. He currently has active projects relating to enhanced rock weathering and crop nutrition in Brazil and the UK, developing others in Thailand. And his work in the UK includes major funded projects for the Ministry of Defence in the context of soil carbon capture as a process needed to achieve net zero. David has over 160 peer-reviewed journal papers and has been awarded recent prizes that relate to his work on soils, receiving the Clay Minerals Group of the Mineralogical Society's designation as George Brown Lecturer for 2021. So without further ado, over to you, David.
Right, thank you very much, and I hope you can see my presentation. I'd like to thank Bruce for setting the scene and preparing the ground, if I might use those words, so allowed me to say perhaps rather fewer words in my presentation, because what I'm going to focus on is the role of the subsurface in the sense of the way in which enhanced rock weathering is suddenly appearing as a nature-based solution which is growing so rapidly that there are all sorts of implications. We know that the targets that some commercial operations have in this space are very ambitious. So there's a company called Undo, which is planning to remove 1 billion tons of CO2 by 2030 as a hard target. And this is an ambition which is really, really laudable and very, very ambitious. and the scale goes all the way down to what Bruce was describing about the development of local activities. And one of the concepts we have is the concept of carbon capture gardens, which is where this process is used to really bring it home to people how they can use enhanced rock weathering in their own gardens and in their own landscaping, particularly in urban environments. So I'm going to focus on the science behind this and then talk about some of the implications of how it's put into practice. And it's a nature-based solution. We're looking at a natural process here by which rock removes atmospheric CO2, and that has controlled the CO2 content of our atmosphere throughout geological time. So we know it happens, we know very well that it happens. It's a process which involves the weathering of rocks, and that weathering of rocks is a fundamental soil forming process. It releases the nutrients that crops need for growth, the major elements like potassium in particular, silicon for grasses and cereals, but also trace elements. And if we look at enhanced rock weathering as a process we can use in handling land, in helping manage land better, there are two benefits. One of them is to reduce the dependency on chemical fertilizers, although there's no scope for that influencing nitrogen fertilizers. Enhanced rock weathering has no impact on nitrogen fertilizer use. But the one which I'm going to focus on today here is the removal of atmospheric CO2. Now, if we go back to Geology 101, then people learn about rock weathering. And we've got the mineral names in this image here, those which are least resistant to weathering and so weather fastest at the top of this screen, and those which are most resistant to weathering and survive all the way through to the end of the weathering process, such as quartz at the bottom of the screen. And you can see that particular minerals release particular elements. So magnesium, magnesium ion and calcium coming off from the least resistant minerals, then potassium coming through in rather more resistant minerals, a bit of magnesium still, calcium and sodium coming through from the least resistant, and then working their way through to potassium again at the end. This weathering sequence is one which is extremely well known and has been known for, well, 100 years, but documented by Golditch in 1938. The important thing about this is carbon. And the reason I say that is because when these cations are released, they're released as charged ions. They have a positive charge, and you've got to have an equal negative charge in solution. Otherwise, it won't work. You cannot have a solution, a soil solution, which has only one type of ion within it. You've got to have a counterbalancing anion, a negative charge. And in this case, this is bicarbonate. That's the natural anion that is most readily available. And where does it come from? Well, we can look at plants as being a CO2 pump. So when we look at the green growth of a plant above the ground surface, we know that that is photosynthesis that has created that, taking carbon from the atmosphere. But what we forget, or we perhaps don't pay as much attention to as we should, is what's happening below the ground. And below the ground, we've got an equal amount of carbon going through the root system, but not just forming the biological materials within the root system itself, but also being exuded by the root system like the organic acids. The below ground biological activity is enormous. The organic acids provide substrates for microbes, the roots are being turned over, decomposed and so on as they die. And that's a very complex set of processes, but the bottom line is that it all ends up, all that carbon ends up as CO2 effectively in the soil solution. And that then goes into the soil solution where a proportion of it forms carbonic acid, H2CO3. And here schematically at the bottom of the screen, you can see that carbonic acid reacting with a calcium silicate to give you calcium carbonate and silica in solution. And of course, the calcium carbonate you can find as pedogenic carbonates. They're well known and have been studied for decades and used to determine past climate. So if you want to just put it in a nutshell, if you don't like chemical equations, we can take a fresh silicate rock, add water and CO2, and we produce soil with cations and bicarbonate in solution. This takes us into enhanced rock weathering, because this is a process we want to exploit to take CO2 out of the atmosphere through the artificial enhancement of this rock weathering process. And the basis for this is to crush the rock, but you've got to have the right sort of rock, then to spread it to land. And then once it's spread into soil, nature actually takes over and does the rest. And this is the inherent property of it being a nature-based solution. So let's have a look at the process. There's a pipeline to enhanced rock weathering. you have the mining of the rock. It's processed. It then is loaded from the stockpile in the quarries, taken by road normally to be spread in the field. And then in the field, it goes into the weathering process where CO2 is removed and goes into the soil solution. So within this, we've got the pipeline, if you like, where the production is something which is constant for many, many years, because you're producing this from a fixed plant that has taken a certain amount of capital investment and is not going to change very much over time, be updated and but not modified greatly necessarily for many, many years. Then, unique to each customer, and there may be thousands of these, you've got the distribution costs and then the spreading, you've got the different crop types, different soil types. And this is something which has to be taken into account when looking at the life cycle analysis in particular of this process. And I'll come back to that shortly. And then in the weathering side of things, for quantifying, and Bruce mentioned how important quantification was, and I fully agree. This is the difficult bit here, because we're looking at an open system where weathering is taking place, so something is disappearing. How do we determine that? Modeling and measurement to calibrate those models is the key thing here. So when we look at what we mine, then we want to get the right rock at the right scale. And here you can see in the top left, we've got a quarry producing this rock. The rock is there with a finger on it in the bottom left picture here. We can then look at it under the microscope in the top right, and we can see textural variation there, different minerals there. We can then go to the scanning electron microscope to scale it up again. We can do chemical analysis, we can do mineralogical analysis. The bottom line is that we're dealing with a very, very complex material, and it's very easy to fall into traps and not to be fully aware of what the material is that you're actually working. So this bit is really important. The important thing about this is that only then, when you've got the right data, can you estimate the potential CO2 removal for a particular rock. And you need to have the expertise that comes from a competent person to be sure that you've got the right information and it's being correctly used. And this is where the Geological Society comes in through the professional status, in the same way that BS Cubed comes in with the professional status for soil scientists, in delivering a competence that allows people to trust the person signing off the claim for the CO2 removal. Then when we go to the destination of the carbon, where does the carbon go? Well, I mentioned modelling and measurement, and those are vital, and that typically we might bear in mind that if we look at a soil system here, we apply the rock dust to the soil, and we've got, when it rains, we've got evapotranspiration, which will see some water going back into the atmosphere. We've got surface flow taking it to surface water systems, and we have groundwater flow. One of the key things about enhanced rock weathering is we need to understand the groundwater flow, because that varies from one part of the planet to another. Of rainwater, precipitation that isn't evapotranspirated. In the UK, the back of the envelope calculation says 10% goes into groundwater, but in Brazil it's 50%, and that makes a very, very big difference to understanding the destination of this carbon that's gone through to bicarbonate. The experiments that are used to measure this are like on the left of the screen here, very simple experiments, a bucket of soil in this case on top of a receptor that can take the water that's coming through the soil. Chemical analysis to measure bicarbonate is the bottom line here, and that then is used to calibrate the models of carbonation and transport. It's very important to think that basalt is actually an aquifer. And in Brazil and many other parts of the world, in fact, in total, hundreds of millions of people worldwide will be drinking groundwater from basalt aquifers, and it is perfectly safe to drink. So that helps understand some of the issues relating to the safety of using these particular rocks, that people drink water from them all over the world. Then the carbon cost here, this is the one which is really important to bear in mind, because what's the point of having CO2 removal if it costs more through crushing and transport than the benefit? And this is really interesting. When you look at the carbon cost of a quarry like this one here, you can see you've got the fixed costs of putting in all this installation here. It can be very cheap. It uses electric power, hydroelectricity in Brazil. It could use green electricity more than it does now. The cost of producing this is the same. A ton of rock crushed is about the same as a litre of milk. So it's a very, very low carbon cost, very efficient process. Then when you move to spreading in the field, these are customer specific with customer's own equipment, diesel powered. Then we start to see a higher carbon cost coming in for transport, distribution, and spreading. But we can measure both of these. They're two different systems, they're connected, they need to be considered as two separate systems with the connection apparent for each single case. So the role of the subsurface here, just to wrap up and leave time for questions, is that we here see the opportunity for geological materials to be used increasingly for soils for particular purposes, for nature-based solutions. The important thing about this is when it comes to scaling, even with an ambitious target of 1 billion tonnes per year, 1 billion tonnes total CO2 removal, which is 5 billion tonnes of rock typically that needs to be spread to soil, we actually have the infrastructure to do that. We've got the regulatory infrastructure, we've got the physical infrastructure, it's already there, and so it's possible to scale rapidly. The key challenge in all of this is the validation of the CO2 removal, because that is a difficult thing. How do you measure something that's disappearing? How do you measure something that's being taken from the atmosphere through a weathering process into an open system, which is effectively what the soil solution is? Thank you.
Thank you, David. And leaving plenty of time for questions. So people have been sending in their questions, so I will go through. And one or a couple from Marta for you, David. She's interested in knowing about this material in UK soils where perhaps there might be high magnesium or heavy clay, and the effect on soil pH, which might have an effect on nutrient cycling.
Yeah, so this is the bit I haven't talked about, I suppose, is that before you use any of these crushed rocks, you really do need to know the soil that you're going to apply them to and what the soil characteristics are. So typically, when we've tried these experiments, we've been doing these on Newcastle University farms, for example, we're seeing a pH change from maybe 6.5 to 7. Okay, so spreading 20 tonnes per hectare. So quite small changes in pH, but there is a tendency for the use of some of these crushed rocks to raise the pH slightly. But again, it's a case of understanding the application in terms of the mineralogy of the soil that you're working with, not just the chemistry of the soil, but what minerals are actually in the soil in terms of geological minerals and the mineralogy of the rock that you're spreading. So everything is very, very case specific.
Thank you. And I'm going to head back to Bruce for a moment. Willie Towers says, great talk, Bruce, inspiring actually. In one of your slides, you mentioned identifying the disbenefits of approaches. Have you come across any or other unintended consequences? And if you have, how do you resolve them?
Yeah, I think in all these conversations, and particularly when you try to elevate the conversations into system thinking, multidisciplinary thinking, you do need to be very conscious of potential conflict, of potential unintended consequences. And you know, we're still in the place where soils lack legislation, limited policy, compared to, say, biodiversity, where we now have this mandated requirement. And I think we do need to be careful and mindful that we don't slip into sort of more siloed thinking. So, you know, absolute biodiversity is absolutely critical in enhancing biodiversity, but we need to make sure that's being done in the context of what other benefits there are. And I talk to my colleagues who specialize in biodiversity net gain, and they are very conscious of promoting the conversation around layering the benefits. How can we look at the multifunctionality, the multiple benefits that can be received from any location? But those conversations will probably always have to take into account that we can't deliver everything everywhere. And so I come back to that sort of you know, thinking about soil forming factors. Our soils, as an example, are a kind of a unique representation of the specific climate, topography, geology, etc., in any given location. And I think if that's our starting point, that starts to inform us what's the art of the possible, what can we achieve, and then we've got to look at the other drivers. Who, you know, where does funding come from? What does funding need to focus on? What targets do those individuals or those companies who are involved, what do they want to try to deliver? And it's a bit a puzzle to put together. But I think if we're open and we're collaborative, I think we can minimize any sort of risk of disbenefits.
Thanks, Bruce. Another one from Annalise Whiteley, kind of on the same topic there, was saying about the importance of soils and careful soil management. How is that transferred from transferred through to the developer and implemented, especially in the construction phase, where performance of developers, volume house builders and their ground workers might be poor regarding soils?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And I think we've come a long way. I did unfortunately hear someone at a meeting only last week use the phrase muck shift, but in relation to soil movement on a construction site. But generally, you know, a lot of people I talk to and work with who are developers or contractors recognise that it's not a muck shift. It's not just dig it up, shift it somewhere, and then get on with the important stuff. But I think there is still a big gap, and I would say perhaps the key thing is skills and knowledge. So these sorts of conversations and engagement, we need to make sure we're talking to as broad an audience as possible. We need to make sure we're engaging with local authorities to work out and to understand where the skill gaps lie, where the knowledge gaps lie, and how can we work together to fill those? Because, you know, probably the question, you know, it is right. There are situations where, you know, we can write a detailed soil management plan, but it sit on a shelf and no one will actually go and look at it. So that implementation phase is really, really important. But we've come a long way. You know, a lot of people I work with now are very well informed, and you know, some of the conversations I have are really truly recognizing the importance of getting the soil right, in order for not because they're interested in soils, but they want to deliver high quality, high value housing, to use housing as an example.
Thanks, Bruce. And whilst we're coming to you for questions, I've got one. So I was lucky enough to go to COP27 last year, and I felt like the risk associated with investing in climate change mitigation was still considered such a big risk. And I was wondering, from your experience of COP28, did you sense a change in this, particularly with that increased conversation around soils?
Yeah, I think there is a growing drive around investment in all aspects of climate change, mitigation in particular. And I think it's through having been, as I said, I've been to 3 COPs, having been to all of them. I think the prevalence of funders, green funders, sitting on panels in conversations has grown, and I think that's really, really important, because all this requires the funding as well. But you know, the question talked about mitigation, and I know definitely from Glasgow COP26 there was a lot of talk around how the adaptation piece was not being invested in. Everyone was focused on mitigation, but the climate is changing. The climate has changed, and so we've got to make sure we've got the sufficient funding. And there was a call at COP26 for equitable funding between climate change mitigation and adaptation. I think that shifted, and I definitely COP28 I found there were more conversations around that were picking up on adaptation as well, but maybe that's an area to focus on.
Thanks, Bruce. Moving back to David now, I've got a question from Christopher Lakey. What are some of the controls on the rate of CO2 removal by enhanced weathering?
Thanks. The key to this is understanding the weathering rates of the individual minerals that are present in these rocks. So different minerals weather at different rates, and so you need to know what the mineralogical composition of the rock is, so that you can then use published weathering rates to be able to model the weathering of the composite mixture that the rock is made of. But equally, you need to take into account the grain size, and so the finer grained the material, the more quickly it weathers. And there's a sweet spot, if you like, in the way in which these materials are reduced in size. You've got the energy cost of reducing grain size on the one hand to worry about. So it costs a lot of energy to get a flour like the flour you use for cooking, in terms of how it feels between the fingers. And then you can that would be the ideal for getting the most rapid reaction. But then there's a compromise where you might not go that far, spend a lot less energy on crushing, but you'd have a coarser material that feels gritty in the fingers. And that material is a material which most people are using because it works adequately. So this is where the rate depends on the rock type, the minerals in the rock, and the amount to which it has been crushed and milled.
Thanks, David. And another one from Chris in terms of can we put a monetary value on the carbon capture to incentivize this use of crushed rock?
People are doing that because there are businesses set up who are trading in this method of CO2 removal. And the thing to remember with that is that it isn't like organic carbon. It's very different. You can't take a soil sample and then have an instant answer from a lab from a single number. And the resources that are needed to calculate the amount of CO2 that's been removed and that then can be monetized is that they require a multidisciplinary team of people. And this is where I think we're seeing the development of businesses in this country and internationally, where those people are being hired, scientists and people from different disciplines outside science, but scientists from different disciplines within the sciences, to be able to come up with robust ways of measuring the amount of CO2 removed, so that when those CO2 credits are sold, they're sold with confidence in the numbers that are being generated. And that's not something any single landowner can do. I mean, the size of these operations is enormous, and the amount of money required to keep them running is enormous as well. So the other side of the coin is that there's no harm done to the soil in a farming sector, in a farming setting, by this process. And indeed, you might see increases in soil organic carbon, which a farmer could use for carbon benefits. There are other benefits which farmers have reported to me when talking to them who've been using it. Increases in biodiversity, which is good in that setting as well, but also improvements in animal health. And we know farmers who have seen their vet bills go down, and the saving in the vet bills has covered the cost of buying these materials. So there are benefits which we would never have expected.
And what about in terms of, does it have any effect on the nitrous oxide emissions from arable land? A question from Fotis.
I think the jury is out on this. There are some papers coming through which show that it does, but I don't think anyone yet understands in detail why that is or how that relates to particular rocks and particular applications.
And a question from Mandy Stoker asking for advice. She says that they've been given a silicate-based product to put on the crops in the farm, sold on the basis that it enhances growth of crops. Hasn't been tested yet, but understand how this might work. Looking at your chemistry, if minerals are released, then maybe we can get more growth and more CO2 sequestration. Should I try it?
Well, the answer is yes, it's certainly worth a try, but whether it works or not will depend on a lot of factors, and not least what the soil type is that you already have. So we see that if we're trying to design an experiment with students, for example, to show whether or not these rocks work, we always start off with the simplest mineralogy of soil. We start with a quartz or a sandy soil, and then it's easier to see the effects. And we make sure that we don't add composts, because sometimes in some of the experimental work that's been published, it's the compost or the manure that's provided the benefit rather than the mineral. So you just have to be a bit careful about how the trial is designed.
Thanks, David. Couple of questions coming in for Bruce again. So one from Sarah Coe. The residential example with nutrient neutrality that you spoke of, was it a closed system? And also a question for both of you. How do you judge the monitoring required balanced against modelling verification expectation?
I didn't do all the work on the nutrient neutrality on Optimal, so I would have to check on the answer to that. But it was it took quite a lot of work and review to get to the point where I think we understood what the system was capable of achieving within the design that had been put forward in the master plan as well. On on the second point, so that was in relation to the balance between the monitoring required and whether modelling is a better approach. Is that right?
Modelling verification.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that David will have a view on this, but it will always be a balance, and I think we need to recognise that there is huge value in on-site data, site-specific information, but we also need to recognise that costs money and time, and it's not always possible from a funding, from a time perspective to achieve that and to have that. And so I think alternatives are needed.
Yes, I would agree with that. Just to say that in terms of the enhanced rock weathering world, the protocols are being developed as we speak for monitoring and validation, and they are evolving and developing, and they're not yet complete. But in a few years, we'll have some robust systems for doing this.
And one for you, Bruce, and maybe David as well. Do you think the importance of soil ecosystems, particularly in highly urbanised environments, are being well translated to the public outside of policy? That's from Sam Booth.
Well, probably the short answer is no. But I think there are some really good initiatives, and I've seen from sort of landscape architect practices, etc. Some urban. They're not really sort of urban greening, but slight, small-scale changes to urban environments that bring nature and the natural world into that system in a really integrated manner. So not a sort of a separate fenced-off park. And I didn't show it, but there's an example that I came across at the Landscape Institute when I was judging some awards there, which was a brilliant scheme in Liverpool, and they were able to produce their design, but they did it in collaboration with the local community. They got the local community involved in the build, the planting, the management of those green areas, and their view is that there was a sea change in the perception of soils and the natural world in that community as a result of that. But that was small scale, and I would definitely say there's much more to do on that.
Yes, we found fantastic responses to what we call carbon capture gardens, working with local community groups, with people like Groundwork involved for helping them continue once they've been created. They've been fantastic for reaching out to a very wide community and raising awareness and developing interest. And they take a bit of carbon out of the atmosphere at the same time.
Great, thank you. And probably time for one more question from Jam Ladine. Sorry if I've pronounced that wrong. They say they're from Algeria and the majority of the soils are localised in the Sahara in the south. Their question, which is quite a big question, how can we make those soils productive and capture more carbon?
That's a big question, and it would take quite a long time to answer it. But there are things which are happening with the use of these crushed rocks, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where there are improvements being observed there. But the critical thing is, how do you manage organic matter and water on top of that? It's easy to find the rocks, relatively speaking, but it's the organic matter and the water which will be the key things to have sources of. It does make better use of water, and it can make better use of organic matter. So there are win-wins here, but that would be a difficult question to answer briefly.
Thanks, David. So we are just about to finish up at 1 o'clock on time. So thank you all so much for your questions. And I'm sure if there were any that I missed, we might be able to get the speakers to get back to you. So on behalf of BSQ'd, I'd like to express our thanks again to David, Bruce and Megan for coming along to support the event today. Thank you all for attending. You'll find a quick feedback survey when you leave the webinar, which we hope you'll take the time to complete. The recording of this webinar will also be available after the event on our YouTube channel. And for those keen beans, our next webinar is on the European Journal of Soil Science, as it marks its 75th anniversary, featuring one of its articles on EU-funded soil projects. And this will take place on Wednesday, 7th of February. More details about how to register will be in the follow-up email and on the events page of the BSQ website. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you again.